Please be seated.
Mr. Weber, I invite you to proceed, but it would assist us, and I know that the failure is entirely with us, our old ears, that if you would pronounce your words more explicitly, that we would not have to check again and again in the transcript whether we really heard what we thought we may have heard.
That is very kind of Your Honors, but I think the responsibility relies with me.
Okay. Please proceed.
Turning to the scheduled incidents. The Chamber has received detailed evidence on the snipings and shellings that constitute the scheduled F and G incidents, and how these events are representative of what happened throughout the campaign. In its brief, the defense heavily relies on the reports of its two ballistics experts in its discussion of the scheduled incidents. The prosecution addressed these two witnesses in paragraphs 1049 to 1057 of its brief. At this time, the prosecution will provide some additional submissions on the unreliability of these witnesses in the context of the defense brief. Zorica Subotic and Mile Poporic have provided evidence that is not credible in this case. It's particularly telling that the defense brief has offered numerous citations, hundreds of them, to the written reports of these experts, but cited comparatively little to the witnesses' in-court testimony. The reason is simple. The defense experts and their opinions did not hold up to scrutiny on the witness stand. The cross-examination of these experts repeatedly demonstrated that Subotic's and Poporic's theories have no sound basis. When it comes to the defense's shelling expert, the failings of Subotic stem partly from her lack of experience. As she admitted, she has never analyzed a freshly formed crater in person. She has never been to the scene of a mortar explosion immediately after a detonation. In fact, her only experience with crater analysis occurred in 2010, when she prepared her expert report for the Karadzic case. This is the same visit that she used as a basis for her opinions in this case. With her limited experience in crater analysis, Subotic decided to then engage in methods that were filled with errors. She analyzed craters that had been physically eroded or repaired in the years after the shellings. If the craters had been paved over, she relied on videos and photographs, even though that practice could lead to different results, which she admitted at page 39630. Even though Subotic agreed that the best time to conduct a reliable crater analysis was immediately after an impact, she rejected the mortar analyses that the ballistics investigators had conducted immediately after the shelling events, disregarding their findings in favor of her own exceptionally belated analysis in 2010, over 15 years after the conflict ended. To reach her conclusions, Subotic sometimes even manipulated the evidence in order to absolve the SRK. For example, when she evaluated Schedule Incident G4, the shelling by the SRK of a football match that was mentioned earlier, Subotic used the grid coordinates provided by the UMPROFOR investigation and then plotted those coordinates on a different map that she knew used a different grid scale. And the consequences of such a manipulation should be immediately apparent. plotting the same coordinates on a different map that uses a different grid scale will lead to a plotting of the event in a new location. Instead of acknowledging that plotting the same coordinates on a different map with different scales might lead to different results, Mladić claimed her new plotting discredited Umpropho's original investigation. In fact, the result is the opposite. This shows just how much Mladić was willing to manipulate the available evidence to reach the conclusions she sought to achieve. The defense nevertheless relies on Mladić's manipulation in its brief, asserting the same flawed point in paragraph 1938. Mladić also offered a number of wholly unsupported conspiracy theories to explain the Marcali shellings. For example, on scheduled incident G8, Marcali 1, Mladić claimed that a stationary device was set in the market. The defense brief similarly relies on Mladić's claims in their brief. But Mladić's static explosion theory required a vast conspiracy. Her theory required a professional sabotage team to dig a hole with the precise measurements needed to make the mortar appear like it came from SRK territory. It required conspirators to plant a stabilizer prior to the static explosion. Her grand theory also required conspirators who brought in bodies to the market after the explosion in order to mimic victims. When asked who was part of this vast conspiracy, Mladić couldn't even name one single person. It was something she just made up. There's also no physical evidence to support her theory of a static explosion. Even Mladić acknowledged that. As Gautier, a defense witness and head of the UN investigation into the shelling, testified, the Marcali 1 shelling was not caused by a stationary device, but was the result of 120 millimeter mortar fire. Similarly, GRM 65 agreed in D1442 that the incident was not the result of a static explosion. The static explosion theory is also ruled out in the UN investigation file on page 21 of Exhibit P538. Other times, Mladić continued to hold on to specific opinions, even in the face of overwhelming evidence that her opinion was wrong. One example of this was her testimony in relation to scheduled incident G10. This is the SRK's modified air bomb attack on Krasnitsa on 7 April 1995. Mladić refused to acknowledge the fact that a 250 kilogram modified air bomb was used in this attack. As a supposed ballistics expert, she refused to acknowledge it, even though the ballistics report in the investigative file stated that a fuse from a 250 kilogram air bomb was found at the scene. She still refused to admit that it was a 250 kilogram air bomb when informed that the VRS's own documents confirmed that it was a 250 kilogram air bomb. As if the ballistics information and the contemporaneous documents were not enough, she then continued to deny it was a 250 kilogram air bomb, even after being informed that the Legia Brigade commander, Mladić, testified before this chamber that it was his brigade who indeed fired a 250 kilogram air bomb at Krasnitsa. When it came to Mladić's testimony, Mladić actually suggested that he wasn't telling the truth. Like she knew better than the brigade commander who fired the thing. Mladić held fast to her theory in the face of overwhelming evidence for a very specific reason. She wanted to minimize the destructive capacity of the modified air bomb used from a 250 kilogram one to that of 100 kilograms. Her evidence was a ploy to say that the SRK used a more proportional amount of force against some supposed target. Due to her extraordinary bias and utter lack of credibility, she held on to an entirely unsupported opinion. Her evidence should be rejected. Similar failings and evidence manipulations undermined Mladić, who testified as the defense's sniping expert on the scheduled sniping incidents. As an initial matter, Mladić admitted that he constructed his line of sight arguments without a GPS, and he ignored the OTP GPS coordinates where victims were sniped because he found the information was not necessary. Consistent with the efforts of Mladić, Mladić also engaged in fabrications and contorted reasoning in his attempts to exculpate the accused. For example, in order to lay blame on the ABIH, Mladić intentionally plotted the location of scheduled incident F-16 in a different location from where the victim, Tariq Zunic, said he was shot. Instead of relying on Zunic's testimony about the location of the incident, Mladić placed the sniping in another location, which was less visible from Spikastiana. The defense's brief similarly relies on Mladić's manipulation, even though he admitted, that being Mladić, that Zunic's testimony was consistent with other evidence. Mladić instead chose to believe an unnamed couple that he encountered on a visit in 2010, who allegedly told him that the sniping occurred in a different location. There is nothing in evidence supporting Mladić's opinion, and the evidence on all points indicate that the shot came from the SRK. Mladić also denied well-known facts. A simple example, in paragraph 2170 of the defense's brief regarding scheduled incident F9, the defense solely relies on Mladić's unsupported assumption to claim that, quote, the prosecution failed to prove there was a VRS firing position at the window of the Institute for the Blind, unquote. While the defense's claim is contradicted by its own witness. 1st Battalion Commander of the Legion Brigade, Kuzina, admitted that the SRK held a position at the School for the Blind. This can be found at transcript page 22548 and D514, paragraph 37. The defense criticizes the BIH investigators in paragraphs 1876 to 1883 of its brief. However, in contrast to Mladić and Mladić, the BIH investigators, such as Shabliza, Suljevic, Turkasic, Sokolar, Besic, and Mijakovic were experienced investigators who conducted hundreds of investigations during the conflict. More importantly, for all the defense's claims of bias, the findings of the BIH investigators in the scheduled incidents were often corroborated by unperformed investigations. For example, scheduled incident G7, the shelling of humanitarian aid queue in Dobrynia. The BIH investigation determined that the shells came from the east, toward Lukovica. The UNPROFOR investigation likewise corroborated the BIH investigation and found the shells came from the direction of Lukovica. The BIH investigations represent just one part in a mountain of evidence that the prosecution has presented regarding the terror campaign in Sarajevo. The testimony of witnesses the chamber heard from throughout this case and the exhibits admitted into evidence lead to only one conclusion. For over 3 years, General Mladić and the other members of the Sarajevo Terror JCE led a campaign of terror against the civilians of Sarajevo. And as a result of that campaign, General Mladić is responsible for the charged crimes of terror, unlawful attacks, and murder. Your Honors, at this time, this concludes my remarks, and I turn the podium over to Mr. McCloskey.
Thank you, Mr. Weber. Mr. McCloskey, before you proceed, risk management requires analysis of the past. Talking about speed of speech, I think that I should, even before you have started, already ask you to have compassion with our transcriber and with our ears. Please proceed.
It's nice to be remembered, Mr. President. Your Honors, good morning. Srebrenica. Srebrenica has been a catastrophe for the Muslim community of Eastern Bosnia. A tragedy of such proportion that my words here today cannot begin to convey to you the suffering experienced by the people of Srebrenica. But the greatest tragedy is no longer found in the dead, for their suffering is over. We must also remember the families left behind. Those people who have been condemned to live their lives without their fathers, without their husbands, their brothers, their sons, their neighbors, their community. There's too much pain, there's too much loss for any of us to truly comprehend the nature and scope of the shared misery of the women and survivors of the Srebrenica community. We can, however, strike back, as mandated by the Security Council with the creation of this tribunal, to expose the horrific crimes of this war and try those most responsible for them. Through the comprehensive evidence presented in this case, we have revealed the nature and scope of this crime, this genocide. We have identified the key men responsible for it. We have Mladić in the dock answering for his crimes. The evidence of genocide presented in this courtroom for the last 4.5 years, as promised in my opening, was clear, comprehensive, and unassailable. From the myriad of evidence presented, we see Mladić commanding his forces in an organized and systematic capture, detention, transportation, execution, and burial of over 7,000 able-bodied men and boys of Srebrenica, and the expulsion of women and children and elderly. Actually on the ground in Podhachari, on film, from 11 July through about 13 July. Podhachari, Srebrenica, Bratunac, Nova Kasaba. For the next 2 sessions, I will take us back to 1995 and highlight for you the most important evidence proving Ratko Mladić's individual criminal responsibility, and how that evidence has completely undone the defense effort to deny it. In this case, the indictment has charged 2 related JCEs that pertain to Eastern Bosnia. The JCE to eliminate the Muslim population from Srebrenica, and the overarching JCE to ethnically cleanse the non-Serb population from Serb-controlled areas. I will focus my presentation on the JCE to eliminate, which, as you know, is defined as the forcible transfer of the women, children, and some elderly men of Srebrenica from 11 through 13 July, and the murder of the able-bodied men and boys of Srebrenica. In the months leading up to the fall of the enclave, the Srebrenica population had suffered systematic deprivation of food and other necessities of life, from deliberate restrictions of the aid to the population and supplies to UNRWA to the planned assaults upon the civilian population, all resulting by 11 July in an unbearable situation of total insecurity with no hope of further survival or life for the inhabitants of Srebrenica. These last words, as you know, are not mine. They are the words of Mladić and Mladić as ordered in Directive 7 on 8 March 1995, P1469. I can think of no better description of the condition of the Srebrenica population on 11 July. Directive 7, when successfully turned into action, resulted in precisely what Mladić and Mladić sought, a situation where the Muslim population, for their very survival, would have to leave Srebrenica. The women and children of Srebrenica were particularly vulnerable from 11 July because of that. On that day, the vast majority of their men were forced to flee their homes and families in fear for their lives. The defense argued the population left voluntarily or were required to leave by UNRWA. However, by 11 July, free will had been crushed by Mladić, replaced only with the will to survive. The hopeless condition of the population and the disabling of UNRWA were the result of Directive 7 and follow-up assaults, actions, and deprivations designed by Mladić and Mladić to create this horrendous, inhuman situation for roughly 45,000 people in Srebrenica. The condition of the Muslim population on 11 July was a direct result of the policy of the VRS and Bosnian Serb leadership from the beginning of the war to remove non-Serbs. A policy that has been written down and spoken repeatedly by the Bosnian Serb leadership in official and unofficial documents during meetings and in private. Mr. Tiger and Mr. Traldi have reminded you of Strategic Objective 1 of May 1992 to separate the national communities, and Mladić's Directive 4 in November 1992, which ordered the removal of the Muslim population from the Srebrenica area. As you will recall from Mr. Traldi's presentation of that evidence, this is exactly what happened in early 1993 with the VRS successfully removing thousands of people from eastern Bosnia. However, the UN finally intervened in April 1993 with the creation of the protected areas through Security Council Resolution 819, which stalled further actions by the VRS. The intention to remove the Muslims from Srebrenica, however, remained and is clearly evident in the July 1994 report of the commander of the Bratunac Brigade, Colonel Ognjenović, shortly after a meeting he had with Generals Mladić and Jivanović, known to you now and discussed previously by Mr. Tiger. These words, life has to be made unbearable, their temporary stay in the enclave impossible, so that they leave the enclave en masse, realizing they cannot survive there. These words, foreshadowing the criminal order in Directive 7, were of course not invented by Ognjenović, but reflect what he learned from the meeting he had with Mladić and Jivanović a few days earlier. We know this because some of the words and the same theme was noted down by General Jivanović in his notebook. As Mr. Tiger pointed out, clear evidence that Ognjenović based his report to his troops on the words of General Mladić and the discussion from the meeting he'd had. It's P5273. The enclave, not so that they survive, but so they disappear. And then in August 1994, we have Mladić's comments on videotape, played to you by Mr. Teager, where Mladić not only reveled in the destruction of Muslim homes, but exclaimed, if the Americans and English, the Ukrainians and the Canadians in Srebrenica, in the meantime, it's the Dutch, would not protect them, they would have disappeared from this area long ago. Again, we see the use of the word disappear. As we saw in Jovanović's notes, a word Mladić will use again and again, revealing his intentions towards the Muslim community. Mladić's statement here reflects his frustrations with the UN enclaves and the international forces there, which prevented him from removing the Muslims from the area altogether at a time when he was yet unwilling to attack the UN forces. With the spring of 1995, we have Directive 7 on 8 March 1995. The same day Directive 7 was issued, Jovanović had a meeting with Mladić and again made notes about Srebrenica, P5274. Make life impossible. These words, of course, echo the theme of Directive 7 and are Mladić's words as expressed by Mladić in Directive 7, or words to that effect. In addition to the order to create unbearable conditions, creating no hope of survival, Directive 7 sets out, as I mentioned, an insidious order to restrict aid to the enclaves, obviously in furtherance of to create unbearable conditions. The relevant state and military organs responsible for work with UNPROFOR and humanitarian organizations shall, through the planned and unobtrusively restrictive issuing of permits, reduce and limit the logistic support of UNPROFOR to the enclaves and the supply of material resources to the Muslim population, making them dependent on our goodwill, while at the same time avoiding condemnation by the international community and international public opinion. And of course, this order in Directive 7 was followed and implemented, in many cases by Mladić himself, who personally reviewed the convoy requests and initialed his decision to refuse crucially needed supplies. In one example, found in P1788, page 16, Mladić denied an UNPROFOR request for fuel on 30 March, initialing the request with a big no on the top. Obradović identified for us Mladić's initials here on transcript 14537 to 38. By carefully examining the rest of the exhibit, as well as exhibits P2145, 2159, 2146, you will see Mladić personally restricting materials to the troops to UNPROFOR approximately 29 times. The main staff effort in restricting material to the enclaves is also evident from General Mladić's correspondence to the corps and the brigades, instructing them regarding various restrictions. See paragraphs 435 to 447 of our brief. The next significant document, recording the objective to remove the Muslims from Srebrenica, is Mladić's order of 12 May 1995, instructing the Drina Corps to prepare battle plans against Žepa and Srebrenica, exhibit P2097. However, on 16 May, General Krstić informed the main staff in P2098 that while he was making preparation to follow Mladić's order, he states, and I quote, "We are currently unable to implement your order to fully close off the enclaves and carry out attacks against them because we do not have sufficient forces." So, unable to muster the troops available in May, the Drina Corps plans and conducts a successful sabotage action in June designed to instill fear and panic in the Srebrenica population. You will recall a small unit of the 10th Sabotage Detachment and Bratinac's Brigade soldiers who secretly entered Srebrenica through a tunnel and fired several handheld rockets in the fog towards the town. They also killed a woman that came across outside the tunnel. See our brief at paragraph 449. Milorad Pelemish, the commander of the unit, testified about this and tried to say that they were aiming at a police station with their RPGs. Transcript 33812. I trust you will recall his incredible testimony in Pelemishi and the mass graves of 92, which I will not get into. Needless to say, his testimony was not credible. And the actual successful objective of the attack was set out in his notes that we amazingly had, P7272. Coming into town and causing panic and disarray. This operation, designed to instill fear and panic, is perfectly consistent with Directive 7's objective to make life unbearable. Next, later that month, the Drina Corps planned and executed a combat operation against Dutch Bat OP at Zeleny Yadar, removing that OP and paving the way for future assaults on Srebrenica from that area. This evidence is set out fully in our brief at paragraph 1107 and is based principally on VRS documents and Dutch Bat reports. So now, on July 2nd, the Drina Corps prepares an attack plan on the enclave itself, which I would like to show you and discuss briefly. It is P1465. First, we can see that the attack plan is based on Directive 7 and 7.1. This, of course, totally undercuts the defense that Mladić withdrew the criminal order of Directive 7, replacing it with 7.1. This defense was thoroughly demolished by Mr. Teager on Monday at transcript pages 44335 through 44336, and in our closing brief at paragraph 432. In addition, I refer you to Mr. Groom's questioning of General Milovanovic on this point, exposing the falsehoods underlying this defense, document by document, question by question. In particular, see transcript pages 17123 to 17132. We see here the attack plan to divide Srebrenica and Žepa, as I've mentioned to you before, a legitimate objective against the ABIH efforts to join the enclaves militarily, and the order to reduce the enclaves to their urban areas, which, as we have shown, was designed to drive the civilian population from the rural parts of the enclave into the tiny urban area of Srebrenica, creating a humanitarian disaster like 1993. This, of course, was anything but legal. All thus, and I quote, creating conditions for the elimination of the enclaves, which in this document meant creating the situation that would allow for the attack to now include taking the entire enclave and the removal of the population. This reference to elimination in the attack plan should not be confused with our use of the term eliminate in the JCE to eliminate. In the JCE to eliminate, we are referring to both the removal of the population and the murder of the able-bodied men. The murder to reveal itself a few days later. Accompanying the Krivaya 95 attack order was the operations map for the attack, which shows Mladić's signature approving that order, P1087, page 25. The defense suggests that Mladić approved the operation after the fact. However, there's no evidence of this whatsoever, and it makes no military sense for Mladić to approve such a critical operation post facto. The attack plan has also been sent to the main staff when it was issued on 2 July, of course. The next key document implementing the eventual removal of the population is the 9 July communique from Tolomir to Guerrero and Krstić at the Prvicevac IKM, passing on Karadic's approval to change the long-held strategy to create conditions for the elimination of the enclave to actually taking the entire enclave and expelling the Muslims. The President of the Republic is satisfied with the results of combat operations around Srebrenica and has agreed with the continuation of operations for the takeover of Srebrenica. This document reflects Karadic's approval of Mladić's proposal to take the entire enclave. This is the chain of command in action. While Mladić is not mentioned in this document, no one else was authorized to make such an important proposal to Karadić, a proposal changing the 2-year policy from creating conditions for the fall of the enclave to actually taking it, with the specific purpose of conquering the enclave and removing the population. The next day, the 10th of July, Mladić issued an order based on the successes of the 9 July to begin preparations for the attack on Jepa, P2106. This document shows that Mladić had been fully informed of the events of 9 July and the crucial decision that was made. These are some of the amazing documents that form the historical record identifying the objective and intent behind the crime to remove the Muslim population from Srebrenica and setting the scene for the murder of the Srebrenica men and boys. With these documents, of course, the actions on the ground implementing them in furtherance of the criminal objective to expel the Muslim population occurred. After the delivery of Directive 7 to the Drina Corps, we see direct evidence of extreme convoy restrictions on Dutch Bat and the population. In short, Dutch Bat was barely able to function. This is described in detail by several Dutch witnesses and set out in our closing brief in paragraphs 435 to 447. The deprivations of the civilian population were so extreme, people were starving and beyond hope. See paragraphs 445 and 446 of our brief. Creating unbearable conditions was also accomplished by VRS attacks on the civilian population, with the attack beginning 6 July, as explained in detail in our brief. These assaults, as planned by the VRS, resulted in the movement of the population from the rural parts of the enclave, including the Swedish shelter project of roughly 3,000 inhabitants, into the urban area of Srebrenica, reaching critical mass on 10 and 11 July, when the population surrounded the Dutch Bat base in Srebrenica, known as the Bravo compound. You will recall the testimony of Dutch bat witnesses Rave and Boring, describing how they were present the morning of 11 July when the VRS dropped a shell right in the middle of that crowd. We can only imagine the carnage that created. I want to show you one short clip to help remind us of the unbearable situation created by Mladić and Mladić on 11 July in Srebrenica town. The images show the situation on 11 July as Muslim civilians gather in total panic at the Bravo Company compound, desperately trying to climb on the UN vehicles to safety to Potocari.
Oké, oh, dat heeft hij lekker gezellig gewerkt. Even daarvan pakken. Zet gewoon op. Ja, schuif onder, schuif door. Ja, oké. Stukje naar 4 man tillen.
Those images speak for themselves. As the terrified crowd fled Srebrenica towards Potocari, Rave described shells falling on both sides of the road all around the fleeing people in what he thought was an effort to herd the people northward. You'll see that on transcript page 10171. By the evening of 11 July, the population was completely displaced from their homes in terrible condition, with many with babies and young children, without their men, with no means to survive for more than a few days at the most. Flight was their only option, as Dutch bat had neither the manpower, facilities, or supplies to keep them alive. And NATO air power had proved worthless, as the VRS now had several Dutch hostages. That evening, in his first meeting with Mladić, Dutch bat commander Karamans acknowledged the enclave was lost and requested Mladić's permission to allow Dutch bat to leave along with the Muslim population. You'll hear more about that later. That night, Mladić personally ordered buses for their removal, which we know, as you may remember, from General Skirbic when he testified. Transcript pages 13984 to 13985. Mladić was present in Potocari on the 12th and 13th, commanding his troops as they separated men and boys from their families, removed the women and children towards Kladan, placed the men in detention prior to summary execution. The testimony and video accounts of these two horrific days have exposed this expulsion. The fear is palpable on the faces of the Muslims caught on video. Nothing put forward by the defense has undercut this in any way, shape, or form. I want to show you a video from our Srebrenica trial video that shows the massive numbers of people in Potocari on 12 July. And if you look carefully, you'll see the many able-bodied men scattered throughout, the same men the Bosnian Serbs would have seen the night before. I wish I could bring you the heat and the smells and the sweat and everything that you can imagine, that the horror that must have been. The idea that these people voluntarily left is insulting. Next, also from our trial video, we have a clip where you'll see women, children, and elderly actually being expelled and forced to walk across the front lines 5 kilometers in 35-degree heat towards Kladan.
Nismo rane ponijeli djecu. Samo djecu.
Deus dele lá é assim. Não, tá ali, vou não. Não é muito bom assim.
Ruku joj prebileno, nije ni zdravila još se. Čovjeka mi sada uhvatili vjerovatno da su ga ubili. Šta ću, imam još 4 djece da se pati.
Sve sam raspitljivala. Kako moramo živjeti?
The subtitling was a little hard to read, but the last woman said, "What am I going to do? I have 4 children. I'm left to suffer with them. And then, how are we supposed to live now?" We have seen the document underlying this crime of forcible transfer and recalled the conduct of Mladić's forces implementing the policy and the orders for expulsion. However, that's not all that you have seen in this courtroom. I'm sure you remember we have Mladić's own words ordering the expulsion of the population. On 12 July, Mladić gets on the radio and gets intercepted. I'll show you the transcript. Mladić, have these buses and trucks left? Mladić, good, excellent. Continue to monitor the situation. Don't let small groups of them sneak in. They've all capitulated and surrendered, and we'll evacuate them, all, those who want to and those who don't want to. It's at P1235. Lastly, you heard a tape recording of Mladić, where sometime after the war, Mladić is bragging about how he accomplished his victory over the Srebrenica people. I won't play that today, but let's read what he said. I would not have taken Srebrenica or Žepa if I've not starved them in the winter. Since February, I let through only 1 or 2 convoys. You remember when I played that tape for General Mladić, he had the integrity to identify Mladić's voice and thus authenticate the tape. The evidence is unambiguous and undeniable. The Muslim population of Srebrenica was expelled on 11 through 13 July by Mladić and his forces, acting under the long-time policy and orders to remove them. Mladić gave the population no choice. For their very survival, they had to leave Srebrenica. This would be a good time, I think, to take the break or go to the murder operation.
I leave it in your hands. I mean, there's some flexibility. We are 5 minutes off from 1 hour, but if you think this would be a better moment, there's no problem whatsoever.
Thank you.
Then we'll take a break. We'll resume at 10 minutes past midday.
All rise. We have